Hi everyone. King Arthur, the greatest of all Britons, is usually understood to have died at the Battle of Camlan. But I've seen a lot of people question this. Maybe he didn't die here and went on to do some other things. So let's have a quick look at some of the best source material to see if we can work out what happened. The most influential account of the Battle of Camlan is found in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, which came out in the 1130s. In that version, Arthur killed his arch-nemesis Medrawd, but then it says, the illustrious King Arthur too was mortally wounded. He was taken away to the island of Avalon to have his wounds tended, and, in the year of our Lord, 542, handed over Britain's crown to his relative Constantinus, son of Cador, Duke of Cornwall. And we're never told that Arthur actually died. He doesn't appear again in the story, so his actual ending is quite mysterious. I think that the ambiguous way that it's worded reflects the author's attempt to reconcile two different traditions. One being that Arthur died at Camlan, that would be the real history, and the other being Arthur's journey to a mythical island, which reflects how he'd later been recast in the Celtic mythic cycle. Now, most are sceptical as to the historicity of Geoffrey's story, and this version itself is what inspired the very well-known Arthurian literary cycle. Things like the very well-known Morte Arthur by Malory. But this is fiction really, has very little, if any, historical value at all. So if we want to know what actually happened historically, we need to put the romantic tradition aside and try to find the roots of an earlier and likely more authentic tradition. And I think that we can glimpse this earlier tradition in the literature associated with the nation of Wales, or Cymru as the natives call it, but a nation that was founded by their ancestors, the Britons. And to the Welsh, Arthur was a very real war leader, credited with defeating the Saxons in battle and holding back the conquest of Britain that eventually led to the new nation of Wales forming. Now, the Welsh also mythologised and romanticised Arthur. Not all the sources can be considered historical. Things like Preidd Anwfn and Culhwch y Golwen seem to have assimilated Arthur into a pre-existing Celtic mythical world. But in my opinion, Arthur started off as a historical person who got mythologised, but plenty will also argue that it was the other way around, so it's not completely conclusive. This is just my opinion. Okay, so the Britons never completely disappeared, and the Welsh look at them as their ancestors, and the battles won by Arthur were a key part in the formation of this nation. Probably the best source for this is the 9th century Historia Britonum. Calls Arthur a dux bellorum, leader of battles, credited him with leading 12 successful battles against the Saxons, and I think that this is something that we should see as historical. Now, the Battle of Camlan is not mentioned as one of Arthur's battles in the Historia Britonum, but there is an associated document known as the Annals Cambriae, and that seems to say that Arthur and Medrawd both fell at Camlan. But does it mean that both of them fell, or was it just Medrawd? I have seen some suggest this, so what do other sources say about it? Well, if we go back to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, he told us that he had translated his story from a very old book in the British tongue. Now, to me, this indicates Welsh. Some people have argued Breton. It's not something that makes sense to me at all, to be honest. Welsh is much more likely. Geoffrey's story was written for a Norman audience, and if it was floating around Brittany, they would have been aware of it before the Norman conquest. It's only when they started encroaching on the territory of Wales that they learned more of Arthur. Now, how closely Geoffrey followed the source material is a matter of debate. Some may think that his story is largely based on his own imagination, but I'm one of those who think that he probably did have a source from Wales, but something that he's expanded on greatly. Now, the Historia Regum Britanniae was extremely popular in Wales. It was translated to Welsh, and it's still preserved in lots of different manuscripts. They're usually known as Brut y Brenhinedd. And what's interesting about Brut y Brenhinedd is that there's evidence in these manuscripts that the scribes have tried to improve the text. So they've changed the story a little bit, presumably so it aligns better with native traditions. So even though Brut y Brenhinedd postdates Geoffrey of Monmouth, in some places they may contain more original and authentic material. But the story about Arthur's end is more or less the same in Brut de Brenhinedd. It does say that he was mortally wounded, Brathllwyd yn Angheol, but then says he got taken away to the island of Avalon to have his wounds healed. It doesn't actually say the island of Avalon though, it calls it Ynys Afallach. And I don't want to get too bogged down in what this means, because I'm going to be doing a separate video on this in the future, so keep an eye out for that. One interesting variation in the version of Brut de Brenhinedd is found in the version known as the Liber Chroniconis Britannorum. It's one of the earliest manuscripts, and it refers to Ynys Afallach as Llys Afallach. So that's more like the court, the palace, or the hall of Afallach. On the other hand, Llys could be a scribal error for Ynys. They both end with the YS, but I think that the words are different enough to make this unlikely. So it's better explained as an intended improvement. And when I saw this, it reminded me of how the Camlan story was referred to in the Welsh Triads, Triad Ynys Prydain. There's a good edition edited by Rachel Bromwich, which I highly recommend. The Triads are basically a list of 3 things that recall and reference what must have been very well known sagas or stories in the Welsh tradition. Stories that largely haven't been passed down to us, but we get a little glimpse and clues at the wider tradition by looking at the Triads. Now once again, the Triads only survive in manuscripts that post-date Geoffrey of Monmouth, and elements within them actually seem influenced by the text. I suppose we don't really know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but the Triads diverge from Geoffrey's story in some really important ways, which are best explained as reflections on the earlier story. So in Rachel Bromwich's edition, Triad 51 is called Trio'r Gwartha Fi yn Ynys Prydain. 3 men of shame were in the island of Britain. And then the 3 men are listed. The first is Avarwy fab Llydd fab Beli, who treacherously joined with Julius Caesar. The second then, Gwrthein Gwrthenai, who invited the Saxons over. And the third was the worst, the Gwaethaf. It was Medrawd. And then the story of Medrawd follows closely to what we get in the Historia Regum Britanniae. Medrawd was left in charge of Britain while Arthur went campaigning in Europe, but he took the throne for himself. And he joined with the barbarians, the Saxons, Picts and Scots. They united against Arthur, so Arthur had to return home, which led to the Battle of Camlan. It says that Arthur slew Medrawd, but he himself was mortally wounded. Once again, in the original Welsh, it says Brathllwyd Arthur yn Angheol. But then it goes on, it goes further than Geoffrey's text. It says, ac o hynny y bu farw, ac y mewn plas yn Ynys Afallach y claddwyd. So it says, from that wound Arthur died, and he was buried in a hole on the island of Afallach. So there's absolutely no ambiguities at all in this version. Arthur died at Camlan and was then buried at Afallach. I'll give you one more interesting variation on this story. It comes from a later version of Brut de Brenhinedd, the Cotton Cleopatra version. This one has been edited and translated by J.J. Parry too, and you can read it online for free. And this one adds a bit more onto the story because it says Brathllwyd Arthur yn Angheol and he ben. So that means that he was mortally wounded in the head. Now some might be a bit surprised to hear that the Welsh tradition is so conclusive on the fate of Arthur at Camlan, or the fate of Arthur altogether. The English seem to think that the Welsh thought that Arthur was a messianic type figure that would return to save them from persecution. Now I'm going to read an extract from The Lost Legend of Arthur by Steve Blake and Scott Lloyd. This is a really good book that I recommend. It's not perfect, but what it tries to do is to strip away the romance and the mythology and the legend to try to get back to the original Welsh version of the story. I think it comes pretty close, to be honest. So they say, despite the claims of William of Malmesbury and other Norman historians of the 12th century, nowhere in early Welsh literature is there any reference to Arthur as being thought of as still alive and waiting to return and help his country in its time of need. All earlier poetic references to Arthur refer to him in the past tense, as the 12th century bard Prydydd y Moch clearly states that Arthur is dead in the lines Meredydd marw yw hefyd, mal modir Arthur Arthgrid. Meredydd also is dead, as is sovereign Arthur. So there we are, Arthur was dead, and it seems the belief was that he died at his final battle at Camlan. Hope you enjoyed that video. I've got some more stuff planned for Camland too, specifically looking at the location. No one knows for sure where it was, but I think, once again, there are some good clues for it in the traditions of Wales, so look out for that one.